Hello and Merry Christmas from us at So Much for Pathos, the show that kicks Hollywood in the baubles. I'll be your detective, and today we celebrate the holidays with one of my favourite Christmas movies, Peter Pan. Okay, it's not exactly Christmassy, but there's some snow in it at one point, so it bloody well counts. Case notes time. Peter Pan is a character created by Scottish playwright and author J.M. Barrie and made his first appearance in Barrie's 1902 adult novel The Little White Bird as a 7-day-old baby in his own dedicated chapter. 2 years later, Barrie would revisit the character by placing him as the protagonist of his own story in a play titled Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, which debuted in 1904, and had its story adapted and expanded upon in its much better-known form as a novel titled Peter and Wendy in 1911. Peter Pan's chief attributes as a character are that he is eternally young, juvenile and courageous, which has led him to become one of the most popular fictional characters of all time, with endless subsequent retellings, movies, video games, songs, pornographic comic books, and awfully trite metaphors, including him in some capacity. There are about 8 movies based on Peter Pan at the time of this video, and whilst I could just poke fun at the recent disaster that was Pan, I'm instead going to talk about my favourite adaptation of Peter Pan, which is the 2003 version, because it's my show and I fucking feel like it. Now, the rights to Peter Pan and all of his accompanying characters exist in a kind of legal grey area in terms of copyright. It's in the public domain, sort of. Technically speaking, the rights to the book and stage play are owned by the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children because J.M. Barrie gave them the rights shortly before he died, which has meant that a movie adaptation thereof has needed approval from the hospital since, but the characters themselves are in the public domain. Not that this is inherently a bad thing, in fact I'd wager it's a good thing because it means that no single movie studio can hold the characters hostage through constant adaptation, unlike some other properties I could mention or indeed flash up on the screen right now. The downside means that it's unlikely for the story itself to end up in the public domain for use by everyone in the same way that Sherlock Holmes now has. You just have to wait until 2023 for that because the copyright for Peter Pan in the United States expires in that year, meaning that everything will become public domain and fair use rules apply. It basically just depends on which country you live in, seeing as apart from America and Spain, Peter Pan is in the public domain, though not quite because you still need approval from Gosh to adapt the material because they own it and yada yada. I told you this would get complicated. Anyhow, over the years there have been a number of studios who've put together a Peter Pan movie, the first being a silent film by Paramount back in 1928 where the licence was granted from J.M. Barrie directly, and the most recent being Pan by Warner Brothers in 2015, which was miserably awful in ways that go beyond human understanding. But in 2002, Great Ormond Street Hospital greenlit a screenplay by P.J. Hogan and Michael Goldenberg, which was an adaptation of the Peter and Wendy book, and the first since the Disney animated film in 1958. This is significant because rather than adapting bits and pieces of the source material, like for example the Steven Spielberg movie Hook, which is technically a sequel but has not much to do with the original story except sharing the characters, 2003's Peter Pan is the first full unabridged story to be done in live action, which is a testament to the quality of the screenplay, or rather how protective Great Ormond Street Hospital are of the property. But hey ho, this movie got greenlit for a reason, so let's have a look, shall we? We probably already know the outline to the story of Peter Pan, as it's roughly the same and has the usual bullet points in every telling, but for the sake of having it out there for the purposes of discussion, let's begin with a quick synopsis. It's Edwardian London, and 3 children, Wendy, Michael and John, have a happy life living in a middle-class existence with their parents, George and Mary, and Aunt Millicent, a character invented for this film specifically. The children very much enjoy telling each other stories and playing in their bedroom, though the ending of this period in their lives is signalled when Aunt Millicent feels that it's time for Wendy to grow up and spend less time with her brothers, seeing as she's the eldest. Not too long after that happens, around bedtime, Wendy is visited at the window by a mysterious boy who can fly by the name of Peter Pan, who takes Wendy, John and Michael across the stars to Neverland with the promise of eternal play and happiness. Though all is not well in paradise, as the return of Peter Pan incurs the wrath of the villainous pirate Captain Hook, Pan's sworn enemy, and he begins plotting Pan's demise. It has a very familiar, well-worn story structure that's more than likely been told to you in some form or another already. Kids go off on an adventure to a magical land, running away from the end of youth. I mean, Christ, we covered this exact story in our last episode. But here's the thing, telling a story as simple as Peter Pan is a skill, but telling it in a way that makes you want to hear it again is an art. So the thing with adaptations of pre-existing work is that one must consider how best to approach the material in order to make it interesting. As we've already said, this is one of the very few full unabridged Pans out there, so it makes for interesting discussion when it comes to the nature of what's been changed. The first change of note is that even though both Peter and Wendy are the title characters of the book and both share the role of central protagonists, this version is largely told from Wendy's perspective, with the exception of the final act where Peter Pan officially takes over as full protagonist because he's got the big final set piece fight with Hook, so structurally he kind of has to. Anyway, related to the perspective perspective shift is the inclusion of a longer preamble in order to give weight and a sense of stakes to what Wendy, John and Peter are leaving when they go to Neverland. There's a lot of focus on the family aspect of their lives in the opening 20 minutes, in particular George Darling and his social status as a banker, which somewhat becomes the inciting incident for the story. It being Edwardian England, social status means everything, and so along with Wendy being designated for womanhood because of her age, George is encouraged to attend more parties and become something more substantive as a social figure in society, though this gets disrupted when Nana, the family nurse/dog, causes an incident at George's bank when chasing after Wendy trying to catch a letter of outrage from her teacher written after Wendy was caught drawing a picture of Peter Pan in her exercise book. Not only does this provide the inciting incident for the story, being that the impending doom of womanhood is swiftly approaching at George's insistence, but it also establishes the theme. What to do when the sands of youth run out. As per the story, what of course happens is that Wendy and her brothers run away with Peter to Neverland and begin their adventure, but said adventure is at the cost of delaying the inevitable, to the point where they forget who their parents are and where home really is, having lost it in make-believe and play acting for such a while.
Forget them, Wendy. Forget them all. Come with me, we'll never have to worry about grown-up things again.
And Neverland is more or less openly a land of make-believe. To get there, they fly through a child's fantasy of space, with planets whirling around like hot air balloons, whilst Neverland itself has cotton candy clouds that you can actually sit on and is populated by the dastardly pirates from Wendy's own stories.
Noodler, with his hands on backwards. Bill Jukes, every inch of him tattooed. Hook!
This is somewhat familiar ground to what we covered last time. When Max's time as a child is running out in Where the Wild Things Are, he runs away to frolic with a group of fuzzy monsters born of his own imagination, taking something of a last stand with the sanctity of his childhood being at stake. The revelation eventually comes that being a wild thing eventually gets old after all, and then he returns home. The crucial difference between Where the Wild Things Are and Peter Pan, though, aside from the nationality of the characters, is that there's a lot greater sense of push and pull in Peter Pan, in that Peter isn't the bad guy by any stretch, but his way of thinking is severely flawed. Also, both Peter and Wendy have the same adult antagonists, both played by the same actor, who function quite differently in regards to the way they contrast with their respective opposites. By the way, it's a long-standing tradition in theatre, along with Peter Pan typically being played by a girl, that the actor who plays Wendy's father also plays Captain Hook, a tradition maintained here by having both characters played by Jason Isaacs. Incidentally, hello to Jason Isaacs. So the big idea at play here is impending adulthood and what that idea means for the characters. There's this brilliant dialogue scene where Mary puts the children to bed and explains the kind of bravery George has to enact on a daily basis, being that he's had to put away a lot of his hopes and dreams for the sake of his family, for they necessarily have to come first.
Where did he put them?
He put them in a drawer. And sometimes late at night, we take them out and admire them. But it gets harder and harder to close the drawer. He does. And that is why he is brave.
In one of the first scenes in which we meet Wendy, she tells Aunt Millicent of her dream to become a novelist and journal her future adventures, of which she is yet to have, in a thrilling three-part book, dreams which are shot down by Millicent with the remark that authors are not well thought of in good society, what with it being Edwardian England and all. So one of the chief reasons for Wendy to run away with Peter Pan is that her dreams are perhaps too big or too important for her to simply put away, along with the fact that she's not particularly comfortable with bearing the responsibility of womanhood, or at least womanhood as predefined by the older members of her family, instead trading it in for the makeshift family of the Lost Boys, with Pan as her make-believe husband. This is until it starts feeling too real, at which point she realises she longs for something more than mere fantasy and begins to see the shortcomings of a life lived with Peter Pan and the Lost Boys. There's a sequence where Pan and Wendy are watching a gathering of fairies inside a tree, observing them under the twilight of the night as they dance, and then they decide to replicate the same dancing under the moonlight, and it's genuinely beautiful, as is the dialogue scene that comes after, recalling the ballroom fantasy sequence in Labyrinth starring the late great David Bowie. Wow, sorry to remind you how bloody rotten 2016 has been. Never mind, moving on. Happy thoughts, happy thoughts. Particularly in that both use paired dancing to symbolise the development of adult relationships, something which Wendy is beginning to realise she wants. But this isn't something Peter is at all interested in offering her.
It's only make-believe, isn't it?
That you and I are.
Oh, yes.
She quickly comes to realise that staying with Peter and the Lost Boys, never leaving childhood, is simply not enough for her.
Sir, you were both ungallant and deficient.
How am I deficient?
You're just a boy.
And then the movie does something truly remarkable, which is that it temporarily undermines the idea of its principal character.
I want always to be a boy and have fun.
You say so, but I think it is your biggest pretend.
This is further aided by the scene in which Wendy and Hook converse over dinner.
Pan is so lucky to be untroubled by them. Oh no, he cannot love. It's part of the riddle of his being.
But the idea of undermining the protagonist isn't an attempt at dismantling the fantasy of the character, it instead helps bring Peter Pan as an entity into a greater sense of definition. It's at this point that we get a brilliant transition into the third act. Hook finds Pan's hideout and kidnaps the lost boys Wendy and her brothers as they were all leaving to go home, leaving Pan alone in his bed. Tinkerbell earlier on in the movie has now sided with Hook, feeling jealous that Pan now seems more interested in Wendy, though don't hold that against her, she's so small that she can only feel one emotion at a time. Also, as a quick aside, Ludovic Insigne is the best Tinkerbell, like 5 ever. Anyway, she switches back when she realises that Hook is going to poison Pan in his sleep and saves his life by drinking the poison instead, and dies. At this point, all hope seems lost, Hook believing that Pan is dead and Pan having lost his best friend. But curiously, what brings Tinkerbell back to life is the power of make-believe. And in the wrong hands, this scene could have been really bloody silly, but it works because it's so earnestly played, and Jeremy Sumpter gives Pan so much conviction in his performance that you can't help but feel touched on some level. I mean, yeah, taken as a whole, this entire segment ain't that far off We Believe in Santa Christ, but it does work, trust me.
I do believe in fairies! 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 I do believe in fairies!
I do believe in fairies!
Oh, Tink, you're alive! Oh, Tink!
My point is, I think that this scene is trying to demonstrate the power of make-believe, that it is magical, it's infinite, it can do anything, and yet we're all required to let go of it when we grow up. Those are the two forces at play in Peter Pan, and here fantasy wins in a big bad way, bringing Tinkerbell back to life. Then we move to the final showdown between Hook and Pan, where Hook finally figures out that unhappy thoughts bring those who can fly down. Plus, he also knows that Pan can indeed feel, and so uses Pan's fears of being alone and Wendy leaving him against Pan and nearly defeats him. But even more curiously, Peter is brought back from near death by a single kiss from Wendy. Something grown up, something the power of which he can never understand. And that feeling is what gives Pan the strength to finally defeat Hook, and as promised brings Wendy, her brothers and the Lost Boys back to the Darling family home, where the Lost Boys find a loving family to take them in. It defines cathartic in terms of an ending, but in particular I like the inclusion of Pan watching over them at the window, watching on as his friends find the familial happiness that he can't quite bring himself to have. So in a way, both Wendy and Peter were right about his feelings. Like Wendy, Peter is a child and has a childish outlook, but is at the cusp of adolescence, at a point where one starts to be drawn to the adult world of responsibility and obligation, but also greater depths of thoughts and feelings and relationships. Seriousness. But were Peter to stay with the Darlings, grow up, work for a bank and marry, he would no longer be Peter Pan. Wendy must, like her father and mother before her, put away the things of childhood to gain the rewards of adulthood, kisses for example, and all that kisses imply. Peter, however, must perpetually forego the rewards of adulthood by virtue of his nature. Pan's character arc is about him realising that he can love, but like George he must put those dreams away to remain eternally young, and that is why he is brave. I suppose the reason why Peter Pan is so endearing as a character is because the idea of him is a romance, the personification of eternal youth and vigour. Why I like the 2003 movie so much is because it's smart enough to realise that eternal youth is a blessing as well as a curse, but without sacrificing one viewpoint for the other. It does a really good job of highlighting the traits that come with youth as inherently good: courage, vigour, imagination, vitality, creativity, bravery, all the things that Peter Pan essentially is and has. But it also acknowledges the negatives: lack of responsibility, immaturity, impatience, inexperience. The message is simple and clear. Youth is a good thing to have, but it comes at a price, and the price of eternal youth is stunted emotional maturity and the inability to enjoy the good things that come with growing up. Like kisses. Seriously, the kiss symbolises the entirety of what's good about puberty.
Brace yourselves, lads.
This is a powerful thing.
The problem with eternal youth is that it comes with a sense of perpetual loneliness. In such a state, everyone else just becomes a traveller passing through rather than company. So there's a central question here about the passage towards adulthood and the things that are deemed appropriate to take forward and the things that must be put away. The decisions as to what to put away and what to keep are ultimately yours to make, but choose carefully, because your bravery will come from fighting the urge to open the drawer. Peter Pan is a genuinely great movie, but also a largely forgotten film, which is a shame because for my money it's the best version of this story and barely anyone seems to remember it. The base components of its source create the building blocks for a marvellously realised story with real texture and meaning, and I'm not ashamed to say that I find its best moments genuinely moving. It also functions as just a particularly good family adventure movie. The choreography and cinematography of the big action sequences is rock solid. It's really well paced at a brisk 90 minutes that seem to fly by, and Neverland itself is brilliantly realised by a combination of digital matte work, old school Jim Henson puppeteering, and huge sprawling 360 sets that create an environment that one can truly get lost in. The flying and fight sequences are really well done as well, somehow giving Pan a real swoop and flurry when he glides across the screen, coupled with a sense that there really is a character manoeuvring through the air. On top of that is the array of colourfully drawn characters who populate the world of the story, even with the bit part characters having a lot of personality and charm that get instantly articulated through either performance or through costume design. Both the London life of the Darlings and Neverland are fleshed out enough to ground the story emotionally without falling into the common trap of getting bogged down in too many subplots that can spoil the pacing.
May I introduce my wife?
Mary.
Mary. Delighted.
Thank you, Sir Edward.
And as a brief aside, isn't it nice to have Princess Tiger Lily played by an actual Native American actress? Carson Gray is who played her, and she is an actual Native American princess. Specifically, she's a member of the Haida tribe of British Columbia, Canada. Though, don't quiz me any further because I literally had to go and Google that before I wrote it down. Child or grown up, you're bound to find something in here that you'll like. There's action, spectacle, family, romance and maturity. There's humour and there's horror. It's smart but it's fun. It's uplifting and thought-provoking. And it has Jason Isaacs with a dastardly moustache for those who are very easily amused. Like me. It's just a shame that it didn't do better on its initial release. Most of the reviews were positive, but audience just didn't go and see it. It ended up making back a disappointing 122 million of its 130 million budget, which really isn't fair for such a lovingly crafted work. At least part of the reason had to be because of its incredibly unfortunate Christmas release date. That would have been a savvy choice most years, but in 2003 placed it in direct competition with Return of the Fucking King, which opened the previous week. So it's a surprisingly little seen movie, though now it's available on Blu-ray and Netflix, and I'd very much advise you go out and buy it immediately. Just, don't put it in a drawer or anything. Peter Pan is a movie that champions the imagination in a way that I find ultimately encouraging. It's a movie that says it's okay to believe in fairies, because that's a good thing. And on that note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, that was Peter Pan, and have a very Merry Christmas.